Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. Welcome and hello to this exciting panel discussion on Canadian-made Ediscovery resources. My name is Carolyn Anger. I'm the president of the Toronto chapter of ACEDS and a senior director at Concilio, who is our sponsor today. Concilio is a global leader in Ediscovery, document review, and legal consulting services with professionals and data centers across North America, Europe, and the Asia-Pacific region. It's a pleasure to see so many Ediscovery enthusiasts gathered here today, ready to delve into the rich and dynamic landscape of digital evidence and Ediscovery in Canada. We appreciate you taking time out of your day to be with us. Before we get started, I want to tell you about a current membership drive that we have going on for the ACEDS Toronto chapter. From now until June 15th, you can save 20% on the ACEDS membership, certification, and training with the promo code TorontoMD255. And I'll post a link of all of this in the chat for you. If you are interested in becoming an ACEDS Toronto chapter member, please contact us at toronto@aceds.org or visit toronto.aceds.org. Now, let me introduce you to our very impressive and accomplished lineup of experts today, each representing a cornerstone of our field during this presentation. Starting with Susan Mortzman. Susan is a partner in the Toronto office of McCarthy Tétrault and leads the firm's Ediscovery and information management practice. Susan was named one of the top 25 most influential lawyers in 2020 by Canadian Lawyer magazine. Her creativity, legal and business acumen, and commitment to innovation and technology ensure that her clients receive cutting edge and effective advice. Susan believes that managing information is essential to businesses as information is their most important asset. Susan is the founder of MT3, formerly Wortsmans, which is recognized as Canada's leading law firm specializing in Ediscovery and information governance. Next, we have Lauren Fishman. Lauren is an Ediscovery lawyer and vice president at MT3, a division of McCarthy Tétrault in Toronto. Her practice includes a wide range of commercial and civil litigation matters with an emphasis on Ediscovery, litigation management, and information governance. Lauren has a particular interest in and expertise in the area of privilege as it relates to the Ediscovery and production of electronic records and has worked on privilege reviews for a variety of Ediscovery matters. And next we have Robin Cardillo. Robin is a senior law clerk and litigation support team lead at Norton Rose Fulbright Canada. She works on large, complex litigation files with particular emphasis on class action and investigations. She assists counsel at discovery, mediation, arbitration, and trial. Robin supports counsel across Canada with Ediscovery matters and document review projects. Robin is currently the director of the Toronto chapter of Women in Ediscovery. And last but not least, we have Chris Walker. Chris is a senior manager in KPMG's forensic technology practice with over 15 years of Ediscovery and digital forensic experience in complex business disputes. Chris is an Ediscovery practitioner in Canada and works closely with clients to develop and deploy the best combination of personnel, legal processes, project management, and technology to meet business requirements. From his years spent in the litigation support environment as a consultant and manager, Chris has extensive experience in identifying appropriate and cost-effective solutions to case management and technology challenges. So for our agenda today, we'll begin our journey with Sedona Canada, a pioneering organization that has consistently been a guiding light in the complex world of Ediscovery. We will also be highlighting the efforts of Women in Ediscovery, a robust and supportive network working towards fostering innovation and growth of women identifying professionals in our field. We are also pleased to introduce you to the Digital Evidence and Ediscovery Working Group, or DEED. This initiative exemplifies the spirit of collaboration, ensuring that the world of e-discovery is welcoming to all. And our esteemed hosts for today are the Association of Certified E-Discovery Specialists, or ACES, and we are representing to you from the Toronto chapter. ACES' unwavering commitment to upholding and enhancing professional standards and certification in e-discovery plays a crucial role in maintaining the integrity of our industry. And finally, we will explore the invaluable resource, E-Discovery and Information in Canada, 4th edition. This comprehensive guide is an essential tool for e-discovery professionals in Canada. The 4th edition is edited by Susan Wartzman and Lauren Fishman. And to add a dash of excitement to our event, we are offering attendees the chance to win a copy of this insightful book through a special draw that will be held after the webinar. This is an excellent opportunity to enhance your professional collection of resources. And just so you know, you must be in attendance in order to be entered to win. We'll hold the draw right after the webinar. If people have questions, feel free to pop them in the Q&A box. And we appreciate your presence and your active participation today, so let's get into it. Now going to hand the mic over to Chris to kick us off on Sedona.
Perfect. Thanks, Carolyn. And thanks to everyone for joining this afternoon. So before handing over to Susan, who's going to speak a little bit about the most recent edition of the Sedona Canada Principles, I just wanted to give everyone sort of a high-level overview of what Sedona Canada is and ultimately what we do. So Sedona Canada was originally formed in, give or take sort of 13 or 14 years ago in 2008 by a group of Canadian lawyers, judges, and e-discovery experts. It's really an organization that brings together sort of the guidance and best practices for e-discovery in Canada. At its core, the mission really is to promote fair and proportionate discovery within Canada. So what comprises Sedona Canada and who's involved? So there is a steering committee. So I sit on the Canadian steering committee along with 6 or 7 other individuals. We host monthly meetings to discuss initiatives, projects that we may be working on, events that we may hold for the group at large or people like yourself. And we also have membership. So membership, I will be fully candid, it is a paid membership. And so our membership is made up predominantly, I would say, of lawyers, and then other, whether it be technical or non-technical legal support staff. So someone like myself who has a more technology background, law clerks, paralegals, etc. So really at its core, what Sedona Canada is we develop a number of commentaries or principles. And Susan will be speaking in a minute about the 3rd edition of the Canadian Sedona Canada Principles. But when I'm talking about sort of commentaries and documents, what does that actually mean? So for example, in years past, we've developed commentaries all around social media. So for example, how can social media be used in evidence? It discusses things from a range of topics about technically what is social media, how can you collect it? It gets into case law and discussions about how ultimately this can be brought forward and used in a particular legal proceeding. Similarly, we've got commentaries around privacy and other areas. We also hold webinars occasionally. So for example, we've held webinars around the topics of AI, education, ransomware, etc. Some of the current initiatives that the group is working on are, one, we're developing, again, a commentary all around AI. It really is a buzzword. It's on the top of a number of people's minds, but how is it impacting sort of the landscape within Canada in terms of legal operations, legal practice, etc. We're also developing a commentary around ransomware. So very similar to the social media commentary, it's going to be all around sort of technically what is ransomware, but then dive deep into some of those more legal and regulatory requirements about reporting obligations, perhaps, what is Canadian case law or case law in other jurisdictions, speaking to about it. Again, really, we mentioned events. Again, there are periodic webinars that happen. We do have town halls approximately once a year where we commonly invite individuals to come and share their thoughts about perhaps initiatives that we're developing or ideas that the group should explore. And we commonly partner with DEED, which I'll speak a little bit later in the presentation about, for an Ediscovery conference that is held in the fall, normally in October or November each year. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of background on what Sedona Canada is, and I'll turn it over to Susan, who's going to walk through the Sedona Canada principles.
Thanks, Chris. That's a lot of background. Thank you. So I actually was one of the people who were at Tremblant. I think it was Tremblant in 2008 when we drafted the Sedona Canada principles, the first version. And I mean, at the time, what we were really talking about was email, shared drive data, paper records, when I think back to those discussions. And so I think that the challenge now that we're really facing, and the challenge that we're facing when we were revising and putting together the third edition, was how are we dealing with all of the data sources that are in front of us right now, and all of the new technology that we have to manage. So when you just think about the data sources in 2008, when the Sedona Canada principles were originally drafted, we really weren't thinking about how are we going to collect from Twitter and WhatsApp and Discord and Slack and Teams and everything that we're dealing with now, and not just the collection of it, but then actually how are we going to put it all together, and how are we going to be able to review it and produce it in a meaningful way, because these data sources are obviously important, really important sources of evidence. So we really have spent some time trying to address that. I don't know if we can, do I flip slides, or am I in control, or someone else doing it? Oh, there we go. Okay, so when I think like that sort of background was really in our minds when we were thinking about what do we need to do, and how do we need to update the Sedona Canada principles, and what's really changed, what's different. So I'm going to skip some of these because I'm told I don't have very much time, but I have 10 minutes, but I'll talk fast. So in principle 3, one of I think the most significant change was to add in investigations, and wanting to ensure that all of these principles and the preservation obligations applied equally to an investigation scenario as well as to a litigation scenario. So whether it is an arbitration, litigation, an investigation, all of those scenarios really require that you think about and consider your obligations, your preservation obligations. Okay, next slide. So I think that was the big takeaway on principle 3. Principle 4, which is really about developing a joint discovery plan. And this one I think was really interesting and always a bit controversial, because the commentary has been updated to encourage people to discuss the use of technology throughout the discovery process. And I find in practice that lawyers take very different approaches to it. And there are so many lawyers who we deal with all the time who just want to run their own e-discovery and not talk about what they're doing, and not talk about what's behind the black box, and not talk about the process. And in some cases that may be okay, and it may work really well. In other cases, lawyers want to know what the other side's doing, and they want to make sure that the evidence is being collected properly. They want to know who the custodians are. They want to know what process is being used. Regulators want to know and get that information. So I think that what is reflected in the changes to Principle 4 is really this: parties are encouraged to discuss the use of technology. And I think when you've got counsel on the other side who are pushing back and don't want to discuss it, it may be because there's an imbalance, and you have tools and technology that they don't have. And so they don't really want to talk about how they're doing, what they're doing, the work, or it's the other end of the spectrum. And they really have tools and process, and they don't really want to share their secret sauce of what they're doing. And they don't want you to be able to poke holes and challenge the process that they've adopted. So personally, my view is that everything that we are doing as e-discovery professionals, we need to be able to defend it. You don't know when you're going to have to swear an affidavit, or be cross-examined, or write a letter explaining your process, and it needs to be defensible. And so we should be, to the extent our clients agree and the lawyers we're working with agree, be transparent about how we're using technology and be prepared to discuss that. And I mean, and it's also that sort of cost saving phase of it. Like, you really don't want to, and I think I've said this so many times, but you really don't want to go through a case where you decide on search terms to use, custodians to select, date ranges to select, and find out down the road that the other side has a completely different view on scope. So that's because you're going to go back and have to redo part of it, and it's going to be expensive. So just on to the next slide. And I think this is, actually, I'm going to, perfect. So the piece about Principle 5, which is really about accessibility of information, I think that the piece that's important here is that we really address now some of the complexity of all of the issues that arise from ESI that's stored in cloud-based platforms or hosted with third-party vendors, and how difficult that is to manage that information. So there's some new case law in there, and then there's there's some discussion about the role of information governance, which is sort of that front end of the EDRM spectrum and how that plays in and managing your information. If you manage it well, it is going to be more accessible. Anybody who ever used to think like, I can collect my Ediscovery from backup and backup tapes, like, we all know that doesn't work, and that backup's not there in the way that we want it to, and it's not a way to manage Ediscovery. So it's really having that good information governance in place. Principle 7, which is the next slide. This was, I think, where a ton of the heavy lifting was done and the redrafting. So the principle itself did not change very much, but there were major modifications emphasizing the importance of technology and how it's used to reduce time and cost in e-discovery. So we went from, I think in the first edition of Sedona Canada, talking about using technology and search terms, but now we're looking at all kinds of other technology. And Sedona really always has tried to be technology, like tool agnostic, but really more talk about process. But we are using, I mean, many of us are using tools like machine learning and AI, and I'm not talking about generative AI, but I'm talking about really natural language processing, machine learning tools, and conceptual analytics, clustering of records. We're using all of these tools, and we need to be able to use them in a defensible way. So, I mean, one of the things that this principle stressed was that it's important that you as e-discovery professionals have a good understanding of the tools that you're using and how they work. And then you also have to understand the limitations of them, which I think is equally important, and understand how you validate the process that you're using. So, you know, to me, that's the most important piece. And if you're using machine learning for a prioritized review, it's really building in all of the guardrails around that to protect yourself in the event that there's a challenge about the process. And how did you validate that the tool you were using was actually successful and accurate in collecting the information that you were looking for? The other thing that I think was interesting here in Principle 7 is the list of the pros and cons to address the challenges and limitations of relying on keyword searches. And I know a lot of lawyers are still asking us all the time, like even lawyers who I work with all the time, saying, here's my list of search terms. Can you run these search terms? And I try to push back a little and say, we'd really rather not use search terms, and because we're going to be doing a prioritized review, and we're going to be using machine learning. So the search terms are really unnecessary, and the lawyers can be pretty wedded to using their search terms. And that's okay if they want to use the search terms, but again, wouldn't be necessarily my recommendation in a case where you have millions of records. But if you do use search terms, you have to know what the limitations are, what the good and the bad is. And I think the piece that gets missed by a lot of lawyers is, if you're going to use search terms, all of the records that are not responsive to the search terms, I think you need to take a a statistically relevant sample and review them to validate that you didn't miss anything, because otherwise you're just, you're randomly picking words and there's no science at all behind it. And you haven't validated that the search terms were right. And I think that's the problem. A lot of the times the lawyers want a quick and dirty, here's a small case. I've got 20,000 records. I want to review a couple thousand. I'm going to run these search terms, and they run the search terms and they have no idea what they missed. So those are the kinds of, and I think that Principle 7 really outlines that well. Over to Principle 8, and I think I touched on this.
Actually,
oh, sorry.
Susan, we've got a question.
Okay.
We've got a question for you on, the question is it important that both sides use the same machine learning or AI tools, and then in brackets, to ensure the output is as similar as possible?
I don't think so at all. I think that they can be using very different tools. Both sides have to ensure on their own, in their own way, that their output is defensible. But if one firm is using, I don't know, Everlaw and the other one's using Disco, for example, they're going to be a different process, and it's going to be a different output potentially, but they both may be right and they both may be accurate. So I think it's really hard to try to ensure, just different firms are always using different tools. I hope sometimes in cases, one side may be using search terms, one side may be using machine learning. That's okay too, if it works with the data set that you have. I think each party has to separately assess what's in front of me and how am I going to attack this and do the review in the most cost-effective, time-effective way for my client. And so I don't think we need that parity. Principle 8. So this is really amended to add in the scope piece, which is really important, and it's encouraging counsel to focus on scope of the production, and this really feeds into proportionality, and making sure that the scope is proportionate and making sure that both parties agree on the scope. And we used to have those discovery plans that talked about who the custodians were and what the search terms were, and sometimes that gets you part of the way there. But when you have a really robust discussion with opposing counsel about what you both think is in scope and out of scope, you can hit your productions, I think, more accurately, and making sure that they align in terms of expectations. So we were involved in a case where the parties had completely different views on what was in scope and out of scope. And so, of course, one produced tens of thousands of records, the other side produced hundreds of records. And, there was just such a disconnect that in that particular case that it resulted in motions and additional productions. And so I think if those discussions, if you have those up front on scope, you will save that real headache and, frankly, expense down the road. Principle 10, I think, is next. And I think that the commentary here was adjusted really, and to think about some of the differences between the provinces and other jurisdictions and how that impacts. We really updated the privacy confidentiality sections to deal with the data transfer obligations and prohibitions from certain jurisdictions. So this principle, and I wouldn't say it was significantly updated, but there were some really important pieces in it. So if you have a case where your part of your data is coming from the EU, it's really helpful to go and take a look at it and figure out what are your obligations, and how, are you going to be offside GDPR? Probably not. But it's the cross-border piece. And then principle 12, costs. So I keep kind of weaving this in because I think you have to weave it in from the beginning. But the costs, it's so interesting because I find strangely that in most cases we're reviewing less than we were. even though we have 10 times as much data as 10 years ago. So, we're getting cases regularly with terabytes of data, but we're still reviewing the same amounts that we were, or even less. And that's because of the technology. So the challenges used to be so heavily weighed in terms of managing costs on the review side. And now I think some of that challenge is pushed more to the front end, because the volumes are so huge that you can end up with, depending on what you're paying for data processing and data loading, you can end up with very, very significant invoices or, costs on that front end. So it's thinking about that and thinking about, really targeting collections. So as not to do that, thinking about different ways about what we're promoting to workspaces. Like, so in some of the tools that we use, we can process it at a pretty low cost. Loading it into the review platform is much higher. And so thinking really strategically, what do I really need to load into that review platform so that I can manage the costs better? And that's really that second bullet, decisions I made regarding the process and workflow can have a significant impact. So in a lot of cases now, we're just loading for analysis. First of all, we're often doing early case assessment on data before it gets promoted to the workspace. We're often only loading extracted text because it's so much smaller and such a smaller volume, while we're doing analysis using some of the tools that we have. So I think it's figuring all of that out, because no matter how you look at it, if you've got a case with 50 plus custodians, and I think we have a few that have come in the last few weeks, every single one of them, it's tens of thousands of dollars just on the data side, and we're not even getting anywhere near the review. So I think that's something that's different, and I think that Principle 12 sort of really addresses the different phases and how careful we have to be at each of those steps in terms of managing costs. And I think that's it for me. I think so. I generally, and I always give this advice, but when you've got a really challenging e-discovery question or issue, I sort of always go to the one pager and just read through the principles, and then figure out where I need to go in and deep dive into the commentary and read all of that information, all of that detail, because it's there. It's really robust. It's very, very, it's really helpful. I think the Canadian lens on all of it is, and how we practice is important, because we have a lot of guidelines from the US and other jurisdictions, but having our own, sort of well-respected, well-followed Sedona Canada principles helps a long way in terms of arguing motions before a court, or even just putting them in front of opposing counsel and say, hey, but what about this? And, Principle 7 says this, and have you done this?
Excellent. Thank you, Susan. And over to Robin.
Thanks so much. So my name's Robin Cardillo. I'm with Norton Rose Fulbright Canada. I've been here for a very long time in the Toronto market, and really happy to be here representing women in e-discovery. I am a recent elected director for the term 2023 to 2024. Just to give you a bit of a background of who we are, Women in e-Discovery is a non-profit organization founded in 2007 with the aim of providing women in the legal industry with opportunities to network, exchange knowledge, experiences, and promote the professional development in the field of e-discovery. The organization is dedicated to empowering women to succeed in their careers, whether they're just starting out or already established professionals, with over 30 chapters globally. Women in e-Discovery is comprised of professionals within the legal industry, including attorneys, litigation support professionals, paralegals, legal IT staff, court reporters, consultants, recruiters, and vendors, just to name a few. The executive board has appointed regional directors that work in conjunction with each member elected chapter board. Membership is free to all the members, and the offerings are also free to the membership. However, we are very strict about ensuring only members attend CLE sessions. However, social events are a little bit more open, and we allow others outside of the membership to attend, such as industry related folks, vendors, suppliers, things like that. What we do is one of the primary goals is to promote diversity and inclusion in the Ediscovery industry. The organization believes that by bringing together women from different backgrounds and experiences, it can help to create a more vibrant and innovation industry. We also works to provide its members with opportunities to give back to their communities and support charitable causes. And just to plug a little bit, we have a social event in June in Toronto that is also supporting a charitable cause. It will be supporting Rainbow Railroad. So we encourage all members or people that want to be members to join up and attend that event, which promises to be a lot of fun while giving back. In order to facilitate WE's work, it is joined together with ACIDS as an affiliate partner and is open to forming additional affiliate relationships. It also partners with other organizations for the purpose of participating in conferences to reach its member audiences. So over the years, it has branched out to a variety of different conferences, and we always look for new opportunities to do that to reach the members. Part of the benefits of a membership is it offers a wide range of access to education resources, networking events, mentoring programs, and leadership opportunities. The organization hosts regular in-person events, including webinars, where members can learn from industry experts, such as your panel members, and share their own knowledge and experiences with others. Members also have access to a directory of Ediscovery professionals, which can help them connect with potential employers and collaborators. The Toronto chapter, for which I'm involved, was founded in 2018 by not only the ACIDS representative, Carolyn Anger, but other local industry women. I have been a member since 2018, and as I said, I'm currently the director in the Toronto chapter, along with Rachel Jasram-Bisky, Megan Brandt, Jasmine Lamb, and Nicole Young. We are the newly elected board. We endeavor to provide a mixture of CLE sessions consisting of industry trends, topics surrounding e-discovery, soft skills such as work-life balance, working remote, and diversity and inclusivity training, along with quarterly social events to provide networking opportunities for all the members. Overall, Women in E-Discovery is a dynamic and supportive organization that I'm so proud to be a part of, offering its members a wealth of resources and opportunities to succeed in the field of e-discovery. Whether you're just starting out in your career or you're looking to take the next step, we can provide you with support, guidance, and any connections you need to achieve that goal. We also incorporate a broad network of women volunteers who uplift and support each other and work together to recognize and honor each other's achievements. Another plug is this Thursday, we're hosting a CLE on diversity and inclusivity, empowering women. So those of you that have signed up, great. If not, again, feel free to join up and participate. That would be fantastic. And hopefully Carolyn is able to circulate this presentation after we are done, because I've added some helpful links that will connect you to Women in E-Discovery Toronto chapter, as well as the web page and some other links in case you're outside of Toronto or looking to establish your own chapter in your jurisdiction. So hopefully we will see you soon.
Thank you, Robin. And we will indeed circulate the deck after today's presentation. Chris, over to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Carolyn. I'm certainly mindful of the time, so I think I'm speaking on the next two topics. I certainly want to make sure that Lauren has plenty of runway to cover what I believe to be the more substantive content from the book that her and Susan authored. So I'm going to move through this relatively quickly. Hopefully I'll give you a sense of two additional sort of working groups that are available here in Canada. The first of which is the Digital Evidence and e-Discovery Working Group. So some of you may have known this originally as the Ontario e-Discovery Implementation Committee. It has been around for quite a while. And really what its purpose or mandate is really to bring together a thought leadership, best practices, all in and around sort of information management, e-discovery, litigation support, etc. It's guided in a number of ways by the Sedona Canada principles, which Susan just spoke to. And it really just focuses on bringing together a community of whether it be lawyers, law clerks, litigation support professionals, technologists, etc., really to dive into sort of e-discovery. I would argue focused in Ontario, and candidly, our membership is largely made up of Toronto members from Toronto. So really focusing in on that aspect, we try to be as diverse as we can in terms of speaking to and educating people in and around all of the discovery issues that may impact larger organizations and sort of larger law firms, but also sort of smaller organizations and by extension, smaller law firms. Typically, again, I mentioned the membership is really diversified. Membership, essentially, we consider membership twice a year, once I believe in the summer and once at the end of the year. So feel free if you have an interest. What the organization does is we hold monthly meetings. Normally those topics discuss a number of initiatives. So primarily, as I said, we're really geared towards educating sort of the marketplace about e-discovery, but really giving you practical tools that you can use. So for example, I know I've included a couple links here to the website, but you'll see that we've developed a number of model precedents. So precedent documents about, identifying particular sources of digital evidence that may be of interest. There'll be draft or templatized memos or letters to clients about, hey, you've now been, you're subject to a lawsuit or an investigation. These are some of the procedures you're going to want to follow through within an organization. These are the data sources you might want to consider looking at. We explore areas, and I know this is getting a lot of traction, particularly in light of COVID, in and around e-trials. We have an e-trial, I believe, an e-trial protocol, a checklist of things that you want to consider when you're developing e-trials, whether it be preservation letters, document review protocols. There's a lot of really good substantive templates and guidelines on the website. So I do encourage you to look at that. In addition to membership, as I mentioned, we do hold events. So again, it is the members, I'll put it that way, hold a monthly meeting. And typically what we then do is once a year, for several years, we've now had a conference again typically in the fall in October or November. It covers a sort of a wide range of e-discovery topics. Last year, we focused all of the sessions predominantly in and around sort of cyber incident response and how that relates to e-discovery, i.e. searching for and identifying personally identifiable information, other perhaps sensitive information. We are currently planning the fall session, and there's a lot of discussion around, and I think you've heard a lot of the other panelists mention this, in and around AI. So that's right now at least the preliminary thoughts, that the conference will be focused in around AI, in and around e-discovery. What does it mean? How is it impacting? How is it changing things, etc. So stay tuned for more information about that. But like I said, I really do encourage you, if you're looking for some templates or some ideas about things you might want to consider about any facets of e-discovery, e-trials, what have you, check out the website. There are a lot of useful documents that you can leverage. And I neglected to mention that we also do we have on the site case law summaries. So again, if there are case laws, decisions, etc., that have been made that are directly related to e-discovery, the website breaks down each of those cases and provides some guidance or some information about what ultimately the facts were and what was decided. So hopefully that gives you a good sense of what we're doing on the Digital Evidence and e-discovery working group. Carolyn, I think the next one is ACEDS. Perfect. There you are. We're on the same page. So as Carolyn mentioned at the outset, she is the president of the Toronto ACEDS chapter. I am the vice president of the Toronto ACEDS chapter. So ACEDS has been around for quite a while. It is predominantly focused on networking educating, providing best practices again for e-discovery. It's not just based in Canada. It is based in over 30 countries around the world, the United States, places in Europe, Australia, etc., and really brings together a broad and expansive group of individuals and memberships. In addition to membership, from the ACED's perspective, so you can effectively be a member, and then you'll be invited to all of the events, networking. You have access to certain areas of the ACED's website and resources that may not necessarily be available to non-members. There are also a number of certification courses. I mean, I took the certification course a number of years ago. It was predominantly sort of one course all around e-discovery, principles of e-discovery, considered a number of different aspects in different jurisdictions. More recently, however, there's now been a Canadian version of that certification exam that's been released. So we've had, I think this is the second or third year now, where the Canadian version of the exam has been out. And again, we've seen an uptick in people educating themselves in areas specific to rules, processes, etc., that are followed here in Canada. Membership, again, as I mentioned, is very diverse. So again, whether it be lawyers, technologists, law clerks, litigation support professionals, technologists, etc., really is very diverse. In terms of membership, we mentioned at the outset that there is a current membership drive that is ongoing. Within ACEDS, there is a monthly meeting that is held by effectively the board of directors or directors at large. We commonly discuss events that are going on, things that we're planning, etc. And really what we do, and this webinar today is a prime example of that, is we host a number of informative events or sessions. So for example, we're leading the webinar today. In a couple of weeks, we have a webinar all around sort of ChatGPT and how it's impacting, again, the practice of law. Some of the more historic events that we've run is in and around sort of challenges posed by emojis in the context of e-discovery. We've had sessions in and around case lines, knowing that a number of individuals on the line here today have to deal with case lines. Topics like machine learning, e-discovery basics, things of that nature. One of the elements that I did neglect to mention at the outset is, as I said, there are a number of different ACEDS chapters. There are 2 chapters currently in Canada, one in Toronto and one in Vancouver, both of which have been around now for, I think, give or take 3 years, both of which were launched in and around the time that COVID started. I think that's really just a high level. I don't know, Carolyn, particularly in relation to ACEDS, if there is anything I neglected to mention or that you wanted to highlight.
No, I think you covered everything, Chris. Thank you.
Perfect. So with that, Lauren, hopefully I've given you a little bit of runway.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Fishman. I am one of the general editors of eDiscovery and Information Governance in Canada, the 4th edition, along with Susan Wartzman, who spoke earlier. We don't have enough time to cover the entire book today. However, I do want to focus on the significant updates to the book in the 4th edition. For those of you who are not familiar with the book, it does canvass quite a bit of information about the e-discovery process, including project management. There's a chapter on proportionality. It covers the entire EDRM from preservation and identification through to production. There's a chapter entirely on the managed review process, as well as privilege and the costs of e-discovery. So those are the chapters I'm not going to talk about today. I think it's important to note that the book was supposed to be published prior to the publication of the 3rd edition of the Sedona Canada Principles. However, we knew that the principles were being updated, so we pushed off the publication of our 4th edition a few months so that we could be sure that we were incorporating up-to-date and accurate information. So a lot of the updates focus on the significant changes that Susan already covered in the 3rd edition of the Sedona Canada Principles. There's a lot of updated case law as well. So each of the chapters have been updated significantly. However, today I'll talk about some of the more significant chapter updates. So There is a new updated chapter that focuses on the best practices of e-discovery for collaboration between council, and it reflects important developments relating to how council should cooperate and collaborate during the e-discovery process. This chapter was entirely rewritten, as was the chapter on privacy, and it now focuses on organizational data privacy in Canada and surveys the state of privacy law. And as it was at the date of publication, I think we all know there's probably been some changes since it was published, but it is more of a survey of the landscape and its nexus to information governance, which is something new in the 4th edition. Previously, the book was only focused on e-discovery. It did discuss information governance where it came up. However, there is an entirely new chapter on information governance and why it's important, and discusses the importance of and process for implementing robust IG programs and solutions. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. So I think we can look at the next slide. So chapter 4, this slide just sort of depicts the high level outline of the chapter. So it takes us through a history of a more cooperative and collaborative approach to e-discovery, which began in the early to mid 2000s, where there were developments both in Canada and the United States that signaled a shift to a more cooperative approach in the e-discovery process. The chapter talks about the 2003 Task Force on Discovery process in Ontario and takes us through to the 2008 Sedona Canada Principles, which was the first edition, which discussed the concept of meet and confer. As many of us are aware, that evolved over the next few years to place an increased emphasis on the importance of cooperating and collaborating, and the concept of meet and confer was actually removed, and the updated principle promotes cooperation and collaboration throughout the entire discovery process as opposed to a one-time meeting. This chapter then talks about the significant changes in Principle 4, which Susan has already discussed, so I won't go into detail there, but the important takeaway is that the general trend in Canada is that there's been a shift toward collaboration and cooperation becoming an integral part of the discovery process. We can see the trend in legislation and regulations, as well as in other publications which promote this concept. Next, the chapter talks about a lawyer's ethical obligations. Lawyers have ethical obligations to their colleagues, to their clients, and to the courts, and the various rules of professional conduct throughout Canada each reinforce the concept that lawyers should cooperate during the e-discovery process. It's best when counsel has an understanding of the process and knows about the technologies that can be used to support the process. So if lawyers understand the technology, they're in a better position to cooperate and collaborate. But if a lawyer is not familiar with the technology, then they may have difficulty understanding what the opposing counsel might be suggesting. But there is also an ethical obligation to cooperate with counsel. And so if the parties don't have equal knowledge, then it may be up to one of the lawyers to educate the other one so that they both understand what processes are being used or proposed. The chapter then goes on to talk a little bit about cooperation and collaboration in the litigation context, and the significant risks of inadvertently producing information that shouldn't be produced. For example, privileged information and how these can be addressed collaboratively during discovery planning, including clawback agreements or provisions that address confidential records or personal information, for example, for counsel's eyes only agreements. And then also in the litigation context, just parties should, properly understand the volumes of information that they're dealing with and the costs associated with it, and how and when best to use technology. Technology may not be required in all circumstances. And then if there is a breakdown in the communications, it's important to seek court direction and intervention. And then finally, the chapter talks a little bit about the regulatory context as well, and dealing with regulatory authorities. And that conversation is equally important when you're dealing with a regulatory authority, because they may have specific production requirements. So that is something that we don't want to forget about as well. The next chapter that I'm going to look at is chapter 11, which is organizational data privacy in Canada. And again, this chapter was rewritten entirely to answer the 4 questions that are listed on the slide. So it talks about what information is subject to privacy law in Canada. So information that can be linked to an individual may be personal information, but that's not necessarily sufficient to engage a privacy interest. There needs to be something more. So the first question canvasses, what is required for information to be protected by Canadian privacy laws, such as a reasonable expectation of privacy, and that information needs to be about an identifiable individual. Next, it talks about where personal information in organizations reside. And we all know that organizations may differ, but the chapter talks about mapping the privacy issues by reference to the types of systems that are used within the organizations. So these are best characterized as work tools that the organization provides to their employees, and then sort of all other information systems that the information uses, which could be employee-centric or customer-centric or organization-centric systems. The chapter then goes on to look at which laws govern the private data that's held by these organizations. So there's privacy law that governs employee information, which is largely shaped by labor arbitrators through the adjudication of privacy disputes in unionized workplaces. And then there's consumer privacy, and the primary source of consumer privacy law in Canada is still in statutes such as PIPEDA, however you want to pronounce it, and other legislation, which exists or has been proposed and may be coming into force. And then there's health privacy as well, and each of 10 Canadian jurisdictions have enacted pretty comprehensive privacy legislation that allows the safe and effective provision of healthcare while also protecting personal privacy. And then the last subject that this chapter looks at is data governance and security requirements. So privacy legislation also requires that personal information be protected. And so a lot of the guidance on how it's protected has come from privacy commissioners. Just the 4 sort of principles are that organizations need to be accountable for or responsible for personal information that's in its custody and control. Organizations need to have reasonable or adequate safeguards for the protection of personal information. There's also breach notification and reporting requirements. Various provincial and federal statutes include breach notification and reporting regime. And then the same is true for health privacy legislation, which varies by province. So finally, chapter 12 is the new chapter on information governance. Information governance, what is it? The IGI defines information governance as the activities, technologies that organizations employ to maximize the value of their information while minimizing associated risks and costs. And so why do we need information governance? Why do we care? Because we're experiencing a data explosion. As we all know, that we create vast amounts of data. Each day, the amount of data that we're generating is growing exponentially, and organizations need to turn their minds to how do we manage this data so that we can ensure that it's protected, it can be retrieved and accessed when it's needed, and so that it's retained in accordance with any of its legal regulatory obligations as well as its business requirements. The chapter is a very thorough chapter that takes you through the EDRM, which is the Ediscovery reference model, and the IGRM, which sort of sits at the front of the EDRM, and the various principles of which Sedona has commentary on information governance, which outlines 11 principles that should be considered as part of your IG program. There's also the ARMA International Generally Accepted Record Keeping Principles. These provide a framework that can be used to establish consistent and workable information governance policies and procedures. And then the remainder of the chapter basically takes you through the process of developing an IG strategy and then implementing the policies and the procedures and anything else and technology that sort of is the outcome of the IG program that has been implemented. It emphasizes the importance of information gathering, developing the appropriate policies and procedures, assessing the technology that is required, and then considering how that will be implemented. Typically, there's sort of a proof of concept at the outset, and then it's rolled out, and then the importance of monitoring and compliance. And I apologize, I know I went through that very quickly, but I am cognizant of the time. So hopefully you all go and read the book and it can provide you with some good information.
Well, thank you very much, Lauren. That was a great overview. We are almost at the top of the hour. There's just one question I think we can address in here. It does relate to Sedona principles. And the question is, do these principles apply to BC and Alberta? Susan, can you take that one?
Sorry, I missed the beginning. Can you just tell me the beginning part of it?
Yep. Do the Sedona principles apply to BC and Alberta?
Absolutely. They're national. So they have in various sections, they actually set out the applicable local legislation rules. So I think there was a really concerted effort to ensure that it was not that it is Sedona, Canada, and that it takes into consideration all of the local rules. One thing I can say is that we would love to have more active participation from BC and Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan. So if whoever's asking the question is in BC or Alberta, please join as a member, and we'd love to have more active participation from across all jurisdictions in Canada.
Thank you. And we are at the top of the hour. So after the webinar, we will make a draw for the book here that you see on the screen. And we have 8 copies. So we'll do the draw and then get those mailed out to the winners. I just want to thank our speakers so much. Thank you, Robin, Chris, Susan, Lauren, for this amazing information you've provided us on our Canadian-made resources today. Thank you to our sponsor, Concilio, and many thanks to all of you for taking the time to join us today. Wishing you a great day. Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much.